In this video, I'm going to cover everything you need to know about copying and filtering data in Excel VBA. We're going to look at what to avoid, how to improve the speed, how to always get the correct worksheet, and then we're going to look in depth at the 4 major copy methods and how we can use them. So make sure you check out the description below the video for links to the source code and to related resources. So let's go ahead and get started. When most people start with VBA, they tend to use select when they're copying data, and this is totally unnecessary. Now the reason for this is that if we record a macro to copy this row and to paste it to F2 to I2, this is the code that you will get. You can see here the code has select, cut copy mode equals false, and active sheet, and these are things that we should avoid. We can actually write the code in one line like this. This code will copy everything. If we just wanted to copy the values, then we could write the code like this. So in conclusion, you should avoid using select when copying data in your code, and you should also avoid active sheet unless you have a specific need for it. One very important thing to keep in mind when you're copying data is the speed. If you write the code wrong, what can happen is your macros can take hours to run. So it's very important to understand the very basics of speed. So what we want to do when we start off is we want to turn off Excel functionality. So for example, we want to turn off calculations, display status bar, and screen updating. Now we're turning off enable events for a different reason. We don't want events to run as it may cause problems. It could even cause Excel to crash. And then when we're finished with our code, what we want to do at the end is we want to turn everything back on. Obviously having this code everywhere in our application wouldn't be that nice. So what we do instead is we have some kind of utilities module where we have turn off functionality and turn on functionality. And we can then call these subs from our code or anywhere that we want to use them, and it makes our overall code look much neater than it did before. So this is something you should use anytime you're writing VBA code, but especially when you're copying data. Selecting the correct worksheet in VBA is very important, but it can be a bit confusing. So I'm going to break it down into very simple terms. The worksheet is either in the current workbook, that is the workbook with the code, it's in a different workbook that you only want to read from, or it's in a different workbook that you want to write to. Now we'll treat the code differently depending on which of these it is. Now what we should avoid is active sheet, unless you're specifically looking for that, because active sheet means that you've got to activate the sheets at the right time, and it's very easy to get this wrong. So what we should do instead is specify the worksheet that we're using. Now if the worksheet is in the current workbook, we can use this workbook and the worksheets collection of this workbook and then the worksheet name, and this gives us back the worksheet. The second way we can get the worksheet in the current workbook is by using the code name. So if you look in the project window on the left, you can see that each worksheet has 2 names, one in parentheses and one to the left. And if we bring up the properties, you can see the name at the top. And this is what we call the code name of the worksheet, so SH data. And the code name of the worksheet is very advantageous because if we use it in our code and the user changes the worksheet name itself, then it won't cause a problem. The code will still work fine. So that's why it's very useful. Now we're looking at the second scenario, which is when the worksheet is in a different workbook, but we just want to read from it. So we're going to alter the code slightly here so that it uses the sheet worksheet variable. And this means when we change it in a few moments, it'll make the code that bit clearer. So we're just using sheet and we're setting sheet equal this workbook worksheets data. Now we declare our workbook and we're going to open the file using workbooks open. And then we just simply give it the file name that we want to open. So now we have our book variable referencing the new workbook that we opened, and we can replace this workbook with that book variable. And we use the worksheets collection in the same way. Now we change the parameter to read only because we're reading this file and we don't want to accidentally overwrite it by mistake. And then when we close the file, what we want to do is set save changes equals false. So we don't want to get notifications about the file. We just want to give it a parameter and say close this and don't make any changes to it. So that's how we get the worksheet in a workbook where we just want to read from it. Now we're going to look at the third scenario, and this is where the worksheet is in a different workbook and we want to write to that worksheet. So first of all, we change read only to false because obviously it's not read only, and then save changes at the end we set it to true because obviously we want to save the changes. Now the one big difference between this and if we're only reading from a worksheet is that we want to check if the workbook is open first. So if we're reading only, it doesn't make a difference if the workbook is open first or not. But if we're writing to the workbook, then if someone else has it open, we can't write to it as well. So we've got to detect that. So we use this function, is workbook open? And then if the workbook is open, what we basically do is we give the user a message and we say, please close the workbook, try again, or something similar. And then we exit the sub. Now, if you're using some kind of error handling here, you might do things a little bit different. But in this case, we're just going to exit the sub. That means we're not going to continue. So this is how we get the worksheet if it's in a different workbook and we want to write to it. Now don't worry if you find this code a bit confusing. You can just download the code from the description below the video and use my code as a template for your own applications. Once we've got the worksheet, we want a way of getting all the data that we're going to use. Now when our data is in record format like this, we can use what we call current region. To use current region in Excel, we press Ctrl and asterisk, or on most keyboards it's Ctrl, Shift and 8. So we can pick anywhere within this range, like this for example, and we do Ctrl Shift 8 and it highlights all the adjacent data. Now it stops at a blank row and a blank column. So this is very useful, as I said, when we're using data that's in record format. So to use current region in our code is very simple. We just give it a range and then from that range we just use current region. And that will give us back then all the adjacent data. So let's check this one out. We'll do a debug print range.address and that'll print us out the address of the range that was returned. So let's look in the immediate window and now let us run the code and you'll see that it printed out A1D13. So this was from C7. Now if we press A1 for example and try it, it will also give us back A1 to D13. Now the beauty is if we come along and we decide to add 2 more rows to it like this, then the next time we run our code it will say A1 to D15. So you can see that current region is very useful for getting us the range of data that we wish to use. Now we're going to look at the first method, which is using the for loop and the range. So the first thing we do is we get the range as we saw previously. We declare a range variable and we use the current region to get us all the adjacent data to A1. Now once we have the adjacent data, we use a for loop. And how we use the for loop is like this. We declare our variable, which is a long integer, and we say for I equals 2, because we're skipping the header row, so we start at 2, and we go until range rows.count. And this means if our range data changes, then the next time the code will still work fine, because it's reading to whatever the count of our range is. Now, all the code within our for and next will run however amount of times the loop runs. And we use I to give us whatever the current value is. So for example, we use I here to give us current row. And once we have the current row, we can do copy. And then the parameter is destination, which I'll put in here. And the destination then is the range we're going to copy it to. So we're going to copy it to F. And we're going to use the variable outRow to determine which row we're currently writing it out to. Because obviously it's going to be different each time we go through the loop. So we set outRow to equal 2, because that's where we're starting at F2 on our worksheet. And then what we do is every time we write it out, we just add 1 to this variable. And we add 1 like this. We say outRow equals outRow plus 1. And this adds 1 to outRow. So the next time it'll write to row 3 and then write row 4 and so on. Now we're going to use filters in all the code examples in this video because most of the time when we're copying data, we're actually filtering the data as well. So we use range cells. I is the current row and 2 is the column in question, which is salesperson. And we're comparing this and saying, does it have the content Jill? And if it does, then we'll copy the row. And if it doesn't, we won't enter the if statement at all. We'll just exit. So let's run the code and see if it works okay. And you see when we run the code, it actually worked fine. We got the output we expected. Now the problem with using copy that we've used here is that it's very slow. So what we do is we use assignment instead, because assignment, based on the test that I've run, it's about 25 times faster, which is significant when you've got a lot of data. So we do this by putting the destination on the left-hand side, then we use equals, and then we do the source range on the right-hand side. The one difference with copy by assignment is that we've got to resize the destination to match the size of our source. It won't happen automatically like in copy. So resize takes the number of rows and columns as parameters, and the number of columns is range columns count, and the number of rows is simply 1, because it's 1 row we're copying. Now if we run this code, you can see that we've got exactly the same results, but it will be way faster to run, especially with a lot of data. Now there's one other change that we should make to the code to make it a bit better, and that is to do with the way that we compare the string. Now the problem with the way that we compare the string is that it's dependent on module settings, and it may not be obvious if you copy the code somewhere else what those settings are. So instead we use string compare, and the string compare function allows us to explicitly state the type of compare that we want to do. In other words, is it case sensitive or not? And by using VB text compare, it means it's not case sensitive. Now if we use VB binary compare, then it is case sensitive. But at least it's specific and we can see exactly on the line what we're doing. Otherwise, we're subject to the defaults of the module. So we run this code and we'll get the same results as before, but it's just the code is a little bit more reliable. So this is how we use the for loop and range to copy rows of data. In many cases, we want to copy the individual columns rather than the entire row. And this is actually usually a little bit more tricky than copying the row, because when we copy the row, we simply take the row and copy it somewhere. But with individual columns, we have to pick out these columns. So let's look at the code we had already for copying the row, and we'll adjust this slightly to copy individual columns. Now we can copy multiple rows to multiple places in one line. We have to do it individually. So we use cells, which is simply one cell. I is the current row and 2 is the column. And what we're doing is assigning the value from one cell to another. So now for the second one, we're going to move the column to G, and what we're going to be copying is column 4, which is the sales amount. And now when we go to run this code, you'll see that it prints out the salesperson and the sales amount. And that's how we copy the individual fields within a row when using the for loop and the range method. The key points of the for loop and range are that the for loop is reasonably fast, but using the for loop with arrays is at least twice as fast and maybe more depending on how many times you reference the worksheet. It requires a lot of code compared to using auto filter and advanced filter, but it's flexible if you need to update the data further. So if you want to multiply the data by something or make some changes, then it's easy to do that with the code. Now when to use? Generally when you have a reasonably small data set and speed isn't a big issue, and also when filtering isn't too complex. Because the more filtering that you need, the more lines of code you need, and to do things like grouping, etc. is quite complicated using this method. So now we're going to use the array instead of the range. And the array is much faster than using the range because every time that we interact with the worksheet, it slows our application down. Whereas when we're just interacting within memory, it's much faster. So this is how we set up our array. We declare it as a variant, and then we just assign the value of the range to it, and the value of the range is essentially an array. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to declare two variables, and these variables are just going to have the row count and the column count. Now we don't have to use them, but it makes the code a bit more readable. So we say row count equals ubound, and ubound is an array function that gives us back the number of items in a particular dimension. So dimension 1 here is the rows and dimension 2 is the columns, because a range is essentially two-dimensional array. So now we're going to have our loop going from 2 to rows count. And I'm going to replace it here as well, although we'll be replacing this code in a moment. Now where we have range cells, we replace that with data and we get rid of the value property because we don't need that either. And essentially the code is quite similar apart from that. Now the one big difference is how we write out the code. And we have to write it out one item at a time because we can't take a row directly from an array. So we use a for loop here, and this for loop will simply go through the columns. So now we're going to get rid of all this because we're going to be writing it out one cell at a time, so we don't overwrite. We don't write the row out. And we use cells because we're just dealing with one cell. And where we're going to write 5 is the first column, and then J is whatever the current column is. So the first column will be 6 because it'll be 5 and 1. The second one will be 5 and 2, and so on. So let's run our code, and you can see it wrote out everything as expected, but the difference is that we're using an array. Now, one thing is that because we keep writing to the range, it's a bit slow. So what we're going to do is put everything in a temporary array, and then we'll write out the row in one go. So this is similar to what we were doing before, except this time we're writing out an array directly. So we have to declare our array, and this array is going to be the size of one row and then the number of columns of our region, whatever that is. And that is obviously the column count. We've put the range into the array, and then column count is the number of columns in the array. So now we say temp row 1, current row, and j is the number of columns, and we assign that to whatever is the current value in the array. So essentially this for loop is essentially copying a row. Now when we run the code, you can see that it wrote out everything as expected, and this is much faster than if we're writing it out one at a time, and it's also much faster than if we're using assign. So I've just replaced using range with arrays when we're filtering and copying. Now they're quite similar, except that using arrays is much faster, so the code will run much faster. And second of all, as you've seen, the code is much more complex. Now when to use? So an array is very useful when you're dealing with large data because it's fast. And also if you're running the application multiple times, so you're doing different filter operations and you're running them multiple times, the speed won't degrade that much. It'll remain constant. Now, if you want to make other changes as well to the data and you're willing to get your hands dirty, then it's very useful as well. And you also want to have a good knowledge of VBA to use it, because it's probably the most complex of the methods to use in terms of writing code. So the next method that we're going to look at is advanced filter. So advanced filter has many advantages when it comes to filtering data, but it's not perfect like any method, but in many situations it's the best filter and copy method to use. So with advanced filter, we've got obviously our data, which you can see here, and then we've got our output, which you can see from F to I. Up at the top we have criteria, and then based on the criteria we get our output. So for example, in this case we select Jack as a salesperson, and when we run advanced filter it will produce all the records with Jack. So we can run it through Excel. So for example, we select advanced from the data menu, and this brings us up the dialog, and what we want is to copy to another location. So we've basically got to provide the three ranges. So our list range, this is our data range, is here. So it's A5 to D19, and I'm just going to highlight it just in case. Then our criteria range is here, and our output range, and the range for the output is simply the headers. And now we click OK, and you can see that it ran and it gave us the output for Jack. Now we could put a quantity here as well. For example, we could say we want all the ones where the value is greater than or equal to 3. And then we run advanced filter again. We copy to another location. We click OK, and you can see it gave us back the ones that we want. Now we can do a lot more advanced filtering than what we've just seen here in these two examples. If you go to my website here, you'll see that I've got a table, and this table has a list of all the different things that you can do. So it's very, very powerful indeed. So now let's look at writing the code that we're going to use when we're running our advanced filter. And the code is very, very simple. The first thing we do is declare a range variable. And this is the variable that will reference our data. And so we use this range variable to call advanced filter. Now the advanced filter, the first parameter is to either copy, which means copy somewhere else, or filter in place. And we're going to copy because we want the results to be somewhere other than our data. Then we use the criteria range and the copy to range as the other parameters. So we'll declare these variables now, and then it's just a matter of us assigning the different ranges. So range data equals sheet data AF, because that's the worksheet that we're using, and the range is going to be A5, and we just get the current region of that data. Now the criteria is almost the same, except it's A1 current region. And finally the output, again, it's just the current region of F5, so just the headers, but we're going to take the first row. That's because we only need to specify the headers of the output range, and then advanced filter will take care of the rest. So let's run the code and see exactly how it works. So if we go to our criteria and we'll put in the salesperson Jill, and then we run our advanced filter, you can see it returned all the records with Jill. Now if we decided we wanted just the Jill records where the quantity is greater than 8, we can put greater than 8 in the quantity field, and then we run the code again. And you can see that it replaced all the records with the new output. If we wanted, we could also do something like, we want these records, but we also want any record where John is the salesperson. And when we run the code, again, you can see it added our output as we expected. Now, one real advantage of using the advanced filter is that it does the formatting for us automatically. So if we change this, I currently have it at euros, but if I was to change this to US dollars, for example, you can see that it's given us the same currency format as we have in the original data. Now, another really useful thing that we can do is that if we decided that we only want, say, sales and quantity, and we want sales first and quantity second, then all we've got to do is change the order of our headers and remove the ones that we don't want. Now, to do this in many of the other methods is very complicated, picking specific columns. But when we use the advanced filter, in actual fact, we don't have to change the code. We just have to change the output headers. Now, when we run the code, you'll see that it just gave us the sales and the quantity in the correct columns as we expected. So you can see how powerful advanced filter is. One very useful thing we can do with the advanced filter is get it to run when the worksheet is updated, so that it'll run automatically. So let's go ahead and do that, as it's quite easy to set up. So what we want to do is we go to the Visual Basic Editor. I'm going to copy our existing advanced filter code, and then we select our worksheet in the project window. So it's Data AF, and we double click on that. And when we get there, we want to take a worksheet event. So we're going to use a worksheet event that will run when a change happens on the worksheet. So in the left drop down, the one with General, we select Worksheet, and that automatically inserts the worksheet selection change. But we want just worksheet change, so we go to the menu on the right and we select the event we want, which is change. And we can delete this one then. Then we paste in our code here, and we're going to replace the worksheet name with the current worksheet, which is the worksheet that is changing. And so we say with target.parent. So target is the range that's changed, and parent is the parent of the range, which is the worksheet. And we say end with. And then we can replace all the reference to the worksheet with a blank. And now our code should run when we make a change to the worksheet. Now, there's one more small thing that we should do, and that is we use application.enable events, and we turn off events. This means we don't want any other events to run while this event is running. And the reason for this is that we don't want it to trigger other events, which in turn keep triggering events until Excel crashes, or maybe it makes changes in the middle of what we're doing that we don't want. And so we turn it back on when we're finished. Now, sometimes your code is going to have an error and enable events won't run. So this line won't run. And in this case, what you can do to turn the events back on is just Ctrl G to open the immediate window, paste that line in there, and then just press enter and it should run. So if your events are not running for some reason, this is the first thing to try. So now we go back to our worksheet and we make a change under salesperson. So let's say we're going to say Jill. You can see that it changed. Now if we add John below, you can see now it returns all John, and we don't have to keep clicking a button to run. And even if we deleted columns like this, and then we say we place back in another column, say for example we put day in again, you can see that it updated as expected. And we can also make a change. For example, we could say greater than 8, and you can see that it updates the records automatically. So this is very, very useful indeed. And one thing you can do in the code if you want is you could restrict it so that it's only changes to the criteria that cause the code to update. Now, one really powerful thing we can do with advanced filters is we can use formulas. So for example, if we wanted to use 2 columns to calculate something, so say we want to calculate the average price by dividing sales by quantity, and then we can filter if the value is greater than $400, for example. So let me just delete John here and quantity and Jill, and that brings us back everything. And what we can do is we can say equals, and we do sales divided by quantity. And if this is greater than 400, we want to return the value. And you can see that it returned a certain amount of records. And let's just change those to quantity and sales. And you can see that it returned the ones that we wanted. Let's look at the pros of advanced filter. It's the fastest method for copying data, but it does have a caveat which we'll look at in a moment. Very little code is required, and even if you want to change the columns, you want to change the filter, it doesn't require any extra code. It's very simple to select columns, change the order of columns, and so on. And the formatting is automatic, which doesn't happen in any of the other copying methods. Now we can set it up to run automatically using a worksheet event, which is really neat. And we can use formulas to create advanced filtering. So you can see there's a lot of pros with advanced filter. Now, of course, with every tool, there's always going to be cons. Now, if you run advanced filter multiple times, so if you run it once and then again and again and again, then it will slow down a lot. Because when you access the worksheet a lot in VBA, it causes the performance to degrade. You cannot alter the data before copy. So it does one thing well, it copies, filters the data, but you can't change the data in any other way. So you'd have to do that after you copy. It's not possible to append data, and the criteria must be on the worksheet. Now this isn't a major con because basically you can put the criteria on any worksheet, so you could have a temporary worksheet where you store your criteria. Using advanced filter is a great solution for copying and filtering data as it has a lot of benefits. If you simply want to copy and filter data, then it's more than likely the best solution. Running it multiple times can be slow, so it's worth keeping this in mind if this is a requirement. Now we're going to look at using ADO, which provides two big advantages over all the other copy and filter methods. The next method we're going to look at is ADO, or ActiveX Data Objects. And this allows us to connect different programming languages to different databases. So we're going to use it to connect VBA to the worksheet. Now ADO has some big advantages and we'll look at those as we go through it. So let's go ahead and write the code. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get a reference to the library because ADO is an external library. And we just go to Microsoft ActiveX and Data Objects. And we're going to pick the latest one. So Microsoft ActiveX Data Objects 6.1. So the first thing we do is declare our variable, which is a connection variable, and that's an ADODB, which is the library we just referenced, and we use connection from that library. So this creates a new connection object. So we use this to connect to a database or to connect to a workbook like we're doing here. So we do connection and we do open, and then we pass it a connection string. Now the connection strings are available on a website called connectionstrings.com. So when we finish with the connection at the end, we're going to close it so that we don't have open connections lying around. Now you can see in our connection string here that our data source is the full name of the current workbook. So we've used this workbook.fullname to get that. So once we've opened our connection, the next thing we want to do is we want to create a record set. So a record set will open our query and it will store the data that we retrieve from our query. So we create a new record set object. And then what we do with the record set is we do my record set and we open the record set. So we give it two parameters, query and the connection. So query is essentially a SQL query, structured query language, and this is used in lots of databases. So this query here will return all the records where the salesperson equals Jill. So now we have our record set open, what we need to do is write our record set to the range. And lucky for us, there's a really easy way to do it. We use the range that we're going to write to, and we use the copy from record set. And all we've got to do is pass it our record set. And that's the code written. So let's have a look at how it works. So let's run the code here, and you'll see it returned all the records as we expected. So if we have different queries that return different columns, then what's a good idea is if we dynamically write out our headers. And we can do it using the following code. We simply read through the fields and write them out to the range where we want them to be. So let's run this code and see exactly what this looks like. So when we run this code, you can see that it wrote out the headers and the data as well. So this is useful because if we want to change our results, then we can just write out the headers dynamically. So a big advantage of ADO is that we can use the same code all the time. We just need to change the SQL. And with SQL, we can do some very powerful queries. So here we have a group by query. And why this is so powerful is that all we've done is change the SQL and you'll see that it gives us out a selection where we have the salesperson and their total sales. And now when we run the code, you can see that it has the salesperson and it has all their sales totaled. So you can see SQL is very powerful, and when we want to run this code or we want to provide different queries, all we have to do is change the query. We don't have to change any of the other code. The key points to know about ADO are that you can read from closed workbooks. It has very powerful queries. For example, you can sum data. It's not as fast as other methods. And SQL knowledge is required. Now, when to use it? So if you want to run complex queries, or if you don't want to open workbooks, because all the other methods require that you do, if you have knowledge of SQL, because you'll need some knowledge to use it. So ADO is a very powerful alternative in certain cases. If you enjoyed this video, then please click on the like button, and if you'd like to get notified of my upcoming videos, then click on the subscribe button and the bell icon beside it. And make sure you check out some of my other videos on the topics covered here.